Hello again. A large group of teenagers are participating in a challenge dubbed La Twizy, inspired by TikTok. The youngsters will storm a mall, be disruptive, and then leave. One such group descended on the Mall of Africa recently. These teenagers are known to mobilize via social media to meet at venues and cause some chaos and sometimes start a fight. Last year, a group went to Monte Casino to disturb customers. We're now joined for more on this by Bronwyn Williams, a social media expert. Bronwyn, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I can tell you we had a very healthy discussion in the newsroom this morning in terms of treatment of the story. How do we pronounce this? What is this that we are seeing? Perhaps you can help. What are we talking about here?
Well, first of all, about the expert on the pronunciation, I think you're doing a great job over there. But I think this is a very interesting story, and it's a story that has a lot of threads that we've been tracking for quite a long time. It Flux Trends, and we look very closely at youth cultures across the world. And it's basically our sort of local alternative to the K-pop fandoms that have popped up over the last sort of 5-10 years, where we sort of found these groups of fans who mobilized through social media, found each other, developed a subculture around nominally supporting a particular artist, but then very quickly developing a whole different sort of subculture from that sort of roots of having this nominal fandom for a particular group. What was really interesting about those early examples on the K-pop side is how political they got, how quickly. So you started off just sort of basically getting together because you liked a pop group and sort of what they would dress, how they were dressing and all of that. And very quickly they got involved with politics during the Donald Trump era, where we had these groups of young people who got together to cause anarchy and chaos at Trump campaign political rallies, where they'd go out and book all the seats in the stadium so the campaign thought they were full, so they weren't able to allow any other people to join, so Trump ended up campaigning to empty stadia. So I think that's a really interesting way to sort of frame this conversation, to say this is a global thing of youth subcultures finding each other and creating these cultures online, and then them spilling over into the real world where they have real world implications. And again, what's happening here with what's been happening with the mall challenge and storming malls, as you said, has happened last year, it's happened again now. In fact, the term has been flying around on social media and the internet since around about 2018. So the movement has been building online for some time, and now we're seeing it spilling over into the real world. And again, it's a reflection of how youth are dealing with our current political situation. The irony of the previous segment on your show is not lost on me, where we're talking about the established political parties run by, let's be completely honest, really old people who don't reflect the issues that young people have, basically involved in a stalemate that's not going to make the lives of any young South Africans better right now. And there's a sort of sense of frustration among the youth in the real world here in South Africa that there's nothing in politics for them. None of the conventional challenges or channels are going to solve their problems. There's simply no leadership they can go to or rally around. So you have this sort of youthful energy that has no way to use itself productively, now spilling over into these sorts of anarchist, nihilist movements that we're seeing. And again, they've got their own subculture, they've got their own look, their own feel. I mean, the sort of the all-black, urban, goth kind of aesthetic is, of course, aspirational for a young person that feels like they don't have a community or a subculture to belong to. These things become very, very attractive, and these ideas are more attractive than conventional politics or more productive ways that youth energy would have been channeled in the past. And lots of reasons for that include the fact that our political systems are aging. People are living longer, which means that people are entrenched in positions of power for longer and longer, and young people find their access to actually influence the future suppressed. So we see this energy popping up in different spaces, but a really, really interesting trend to follow there.
Oh my. So we did in the morning speak to a young person who chose to be anonymous, and they would not come on air for obvious reasons. They're in school, but they told us that, well, we gathered together for silly reasons, really. I lose the word she used this morning, but she mentioned that they would then meet people from the south, for instance, and people in the north and from different parts of, Johannesburg, and meet at these malls. There's a brawl, and then they'd emerge a leader that these young people can follow. So you speak of the political subculture that was formed in the United States. Do we know more about the nature in South Africa of this particular subculture?
Well, I would say this is a starting point. So what we're seeing right now is anarchy and nihilism and, trashing malls and teenagers being teenagers. I see a lot of the social discourse talks about that. Some people have referred to it as like a cult. It's probably the wrong way to look at it. We should look at it as this being the burgeoning front of where youth politics could go next. Previously, when we've had youth movements that have been emboldened, of course, by social media, they've been towards more productive, more specific ends, at least nominally, at least to the beginning. And of course, the Fees Must Fall movement is part of that, right? So you had a productive goal, you wanted to change education, access to education, off you went. Whereas here, there's a group kind of without a cause, and that's a huge amount of potential energy that is waiting for some sort of like messiah or leader-like figure to take that energy and harness it. And this could be hugely disruptive to South African politics if a leader emerges out of these movements, which is an actual grassroots youth subculture movement that's been going on, as I said, for some years now, that has some depth that we are not aware of, that hasn't been spoken about in the mainstream media, for example. It's an actual youth-grown leader that could then turn to politics once you've galvanized enough of a following. Because once you've got a following, an energetic following, looking for a home, looking for a place, looking for something to do, whether it's boredom, whether it's frustration, whatever those teenage kind of causes are, they can very easily be directed towards more productive or at least more targeted goals. So I would say this is quite a tipping point for South African politics. We have a vacuum in terms of leadership. We don't have a vacuum in terms of politics. We've got lots of politics. We have a huge vacuum of leaders that young people actually want to follow. We know this. We know about voter apathy. We know voter apathy is highest among the youngest generations. And what's going to happen with all that potential energy and where is it going to be channeled? It's going to be channeled through movements like this, unless the actual political leaders that we have in our official parties with their official colors and their official posters is actually going to start connecting with these movements. So socio-cultural movements can become political movements and vice versa. We can see these trends flow in various different directions. But I would say the space to watch is how these pop culture movements shift into the political realm and start to disrupt more than just sort of mall shopping on the weekend.
Yeah, so you speak of a vacuum in terms of leadership, and then you have parents who are quite worried at this moment because you purchase a gadget for your child and you're thinking, okay, they're doing schoolwork because they need it at school. If they don't need it for school, it's like, but even me, I need a smartphone. So they have a smartphone, but you don't know the kind of activity that they get up to. And so you'll find some parents perhaps blaming themselves, and we say, oh, there's a vacuum in parenting. However, if Lerato says she's going to Mbali's house for a visit, then they call an Uber to X place where they meet up for this subculture movement. What would your advice be to parents, right, for somebody whose child is going to get home today and they're like, hand over that gadget, let me see what you're up to?
Well, I would say that, first of all, parents should be slightly encouraged in that young people have always been young people. Disruptive teenage social movements have been around really since teenagers were kind of invented. And let's be honest, they were invented when we had this gap between being a child and being a worker, which we didn't always have throughout human civilization. They were kind of teenagers emerged in the middle of last century, and they've been causing trouble ever since, whether it was sort of the greasers of the 50s or the punks of the 70s. We had all these movements, and they did start out as sort of as very pop culture, counterculture kind of movements, and then they shifted into the political realm, and that's what we are going to see. In terms of looking after your children and social media, again, young people have always tried to find each other and find their own way and carve their own paths in the world. Like, my parents didn't know where I was when I was that age because we didn't even have cell phones back then. So at least parents today are able to kind of track their children's behavior, whether you see that as dystopian or progressive, that's entirely up to you. But there's different trade-offs and pros and cons to being a parent and to being a child in today's world. As a child, you can find these niche subcultures and become part of them at a much greater scale, whereas before you had to only sort of make those groups of people in your physical neighborhood. From a parental sort of guidance perspective, there's interesting trends going on there in the world at the moment. I think we've got one of the United States that just yesterday has actually put a ban on young people joining social media platforms of any kind without parental permissions. So we're probably going to see more of that going forward, and that's going to become from regulators' perspectives and from parents' perspectives as regulators start to realize the political implications and power of young people finding each other and galvanizing through social media channels. There's various reasons why people would want more controls as to how young people are meeting each other. Again, whether you think this is an overreach of control or a necessary measure, that will depend on your own political leanings. From a parental perspective, we do have, I'm a parent myself, we do have responsibility to our children and to watch them and guide them and steer them in the best course that we possibly can. And part of parenting today is making sure that you at least have instilled the values of what it means to be a human being in real life and online. I think that's the way we've got to start to see these things. Young people will find their way around those parental blocks, just like young people have always found their way around various other sort of boundaries and barriers in order to get to each other. This is a natural part of growing up, wanting to break free of your boundaries your parents have put in place and find ways to connect with your peers. We mustn't be naive in thinking that if we do put parental controls onto the social media platforms, that these sorts of movements will stop. History tells us that's absolutely not the case. Yeah. The best we can do is to raise good people, to be good parents and raise good children so that they behave responsibly and for their own and the greater good in all the various different platforms they engage with, whether that be online or offline.
Oh, my goodness. Bronwyn Williams, thank you very much. She's a social media expert. We'll continue to look deeper into these developments in the coming days here on the channel. Okay.